The Hopeful is my love letter to my faith roots. I come from a faith tradition, the Seventh Adventist movement. I guess I was pretty fortunate that I get to reassess that through the lens of storytelling. When you really dive into who they were and what they were about, what they, kind of locked into that propelled this movement into the future.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cheryl Crisp for Movieguide, and this is Coffee and Conversation with the Hopeful. Kyle, you are an Emmy Award-winning producer and director. Tell us about the Hopeful.
So in the Hopeful, we've got, and this is, true story again. So we've got a guy called John Andrews and his two kids, Mary and Charles, and they're on a boat to Switzerland, to Europe. And he starts telling them a story that at the very beginning, they don't really realize where it's going. And it's about a guy called William Miller, who has an incredible experience and is spared, and then discovers that was at the hand of a loving God, and he passes on that beautiful discovery to a young woman, Ellen, who becomes a woman of agency and courage and generosity and perseverance and stubbornness and deep, deep love. That really just takes that story to a place where you realize, actually, what they thought they were going to get, which was the return of Christ, and he was going to take them all home, actually turned out to be something vastly different than they could have anticipated, which was actually, we've got to take Christ to other people's homes, right? And we've got to share that same hope and healing and love and goodness that we've experienced outwardly as well. So
This is your first long-form feature film. Tell us about that and recreating 19th century New England.
Yeah, well, which we did in, not that far from New England, actually. It was shot in Canada, just across the St. Lawrence River. So you're looking across most of the time into New England, which was quite fascinating. Although you're not in New England, you basically are. It was fabulous journey. I mean, I would sometimes arrive on set at 5 o'clock in the morning, and because we were filming a lot of it at a place called Upper Canada Village, which was a living history museum, you would get handed a chunk of bread that had been milled in the flour mill from 1860 with wheat they grew on the site, and you'd be getting butter slapped on it from somebody who had churned it in the traditional manner. And then you would walk onto set and you weren't allowed to have powered vehicles on there. So it really allowed you, in many ways, like everywhere you turned, felt like you were living and working in that era yourself. So, it was a fabulous way to immerse for everybody, cast and crew alike. And so I guess it helped us to be able to kind of put ourselves into the shoes of someone in that era. And then you suddenly realize really, really quickly that apart from the fact that they don't have many of the technological advances, again, like I was saying earlier, they have all the same hopes and dreams and faults and failures. Like, they argue with each other. Husbands and wives still have arguments about, I want this and you want that, right?
In the film, there's a scene I really love, and it's when William Miller is running into the woods and he's yelling, God, I'm not qualified. Talk about how we all have a calling on our life, and God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called.
Yeah, and that's a nice way of articulating it, actually, Cheryl, because, I'll give you the perfect example of this, right? Up until about 2 or 3 years ago, I did not talk openly about my faith with anybody ever, right? It's not a comfort zone for me, and I dare say that's probably the case for a lot of people, right? Like, there are a lot of Christians who are just like, I don't want to impose, I don't want to, and I also don't want people to think I'm weird and somehow like abnormal. I don't like being a weird person. I like the things that I like, and I like enjoying life with people that I'm in relationship with. Like, we don't like to feel uncomfortable with certain things. And so I think what's really lovely about that moment with Miller, where he has that, like, this is not me, God, right? Like, I'm not that guy. I'm not the guy to go out and do the thing that you're asking of me. I really resonate with that. Like, I'm not that guy either, and yet here I am talking openly about it with you, right? Which probably 2-3 years ago was not my comfort zone. But I think when you realize what it is that actually you were wrestling with about your faith, I think a lot of the time, if you can find a way to feel not proud's the wrong word for it, but inspired by, I think is a better way of saying it. If you can feel inspired by other people who have had that same experience that you've had, and I look at, I look at a character like Ellen, for instance, in the film. Here's a woman in the 1800s who has a third grade education, is the least likely to have any agency in this man's world of the 1800s, and particularly in religion at that period of time, 100% a man's world. For her to have flourished and thrived in the face of that and have been one of the key founders of a movement that now has, 500 plus hospitals in 65 countries. It's the largest Protestant healthcare network on the planet, and
They are beautiful. This movie reminds us of how much others sacrificed to bring us the Bible and to bring us where we can now attend any church of our own choosing just right down the street from us. Talk about that.
yeah, I think that's one of the other beautiful things about stories, right? Like, you don't have to suddenly go, oh, I'm going to become the faith of the people in the film. But what you can do is recognize that, hey, well, if they can hold on to that clear picture of God that they had, well, then maybe I can as well in my context, and it's a beautiful, it's just a beautiful story of people that so desperately wanted to hold on to that picture that they had discovered, so like Ellen discovers this for the first time. So William Miller, is probably like the impetus for the origin of this story. Is in the War of 1812. A bomb lands in the middle of a group of soldiers, of which he's one. Everybody around him gets killed except him. In fact, to the extent that there's not even a scratch on him. And he's a deist at this point in his life. And, if God exists, well, he probably just set the world in motion and is off somewhere completely unaware of what we're doing now. But he couldn't reconcile why he'd been saved and everyone else around him died. So he went off and he read like all the great philosophers, the philosophers of the time, like Voltaire and Robespierre, and those, tried to find an articulation of why him, and couldn't find anything that satisfied that. And then almost as a like, okay, well, just to tick it off so I can rule it out, he picked up a Bible. And then in his words, found a friend in Jesus. And in doing that, he got really into like delving into the who, what, where, how, and why of God, and discovered prophecy, and then wrongly worked out that Christ was going to return sometime in about, the mid 1840s. And almost got swept away with that, right? Like, that's because this person that you've fallen in love with, who explains like why you, if you suddenly think you've discovered a reason for them to return, like, that's going to be a pretty big driving force in your life from that point onwards. It's interesting, like, we remember him for the mistake, but we sometimes forget that he went around and he presented this beautiful friend that he had found. And that's why people gravitated to him, right?
Last question I want to ask you is there's 22 million Seventh-day Adventists worldwide, and it's a Protestant Christian denomination. What would you like people to know about them?
I think above all else, what I'd love people to know is that we have a real heart for service. That movement is very, very service orientated. And when you have a look around at what the main, I guess, most Adventists you meet, you're going to meet them in either an education or a health context. Very, very, very few of them like me that you'll meet who are making films, because they're doing that practical work of the hands and feet, right? Like they're serving that hope and healing in a very practical way. So I think, yeah, and it'll surprise you where you find Adventists, and you might be surprised at who your neighbor might be, and they've never talked to you about it, because for that same reason that I was saying before, Cheryl, about we've cultivated a sense of just quietly going about that business, and not being too boastful about it. So, I mean, you'll probably find that there's a lot more of them in your neighborhood than you realized, I guess, and that they're pretty much just the same as you, with the same hopes and thoughts and dreams and feelings as everybody else. I guess just with that, that one lens of that unique thing, I guess, in Protestant tradition, that Adventists would probably say, well, if you went, what makes an Adventist different to someone else in the Protestant tradition? I think it's probably that belief in that I guess, focus on the character of Christ as hopeful and healer is a really big deal in Adventism. That's a really big core part of who we are, and why we want to go out and set up hospitals, and why we want to go out and set up schools, and why we want to go out and give that hope and healing through humanitarian efforts in the world.
If you enjoy videos that follow your values like ours, and you want to help us continue, go to movieguide.org/donate, because we're actually a nonprofit. You may not know that, but we're working in Hollywood every day to help families have more choices that follows their values. And also subscribe right now.